Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Perkenalkan, nama saya Adelia Neyoan. Saya akan mempelajari tentang local storage dan persistence dengan membaca buku dengan menonton video.
Hey team, we're going to learn how we can save state to local storage and persistent refresh and React. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click the little notification bell for future web dev content. React is a very popular JavaScript library that gives us the ability to easily build UIs for the web. Taking a component as an example, we can see that we use JSX, which is basically HTML with JavaScript on top, that gives us the ability to dynamically create the experiences for the DOM. Now, part of building those dynamic experiences is storing the value that represents the state of an application or a part of an application at a particular point in time. In the example in React's documentation, they use a clock where every time that clock ticks, it wants to update the stored value, that time reference, inside of the state of the application. Now, as a somewhat more practical example, if I'm building an online store and somebody adds an item to their cart, you want to make sure that that state of the cart is updated so that that particular product and the amount of products that I have are updated in the state of that cart. Now, and of course, part of that state is that I know that when I refresh the page or I browse around to another page of the site, my cart state is going to be saved. And I can still make sure that I can keep adding on the products on top of that original item. But in React's case, by default, that state is only stored in memory, meaning as soon as we refresh the page, we lose all that information about the state. So to fix this, we can take advantage of the browser's local storage that it allows us to save data right inside of the storage mechanism of the browser. Meaning we can set that value and get that value so that when we refresh the page, we can treat all that state value and hydrate it right into our app. So to see how this works, we're going to set up a new application using Next.js. And while Next.js is not needed for this example, you can use this with a plain and simple React application. Next.js is just a nice way to get started, stay up and running. And in particular, we're going to start off with this demo starter that I created. We're just going to give us some basic UI to get started with, where we're going to be able to programmatically hide this welcome banner. But you can find the link to the starter in the description if you want to follow along. And what we're going to do is we're going to copy this create next app command. I always use Yarn, but you can follow along with npms. In my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that command. And we're going to also append my welcome banner to the end, which is going to be my product name, project name, in the folder that's used to create this project. So once I run that command, Next.js is going to pull down this repository that I created. It's going to install all the dependencies, and it's even going to reset Git history so that we have a fresh start. But once it's done, we can see that new directory, and we can run yarn dev. It's going to spin up our local development server, and when we open that up inside of our browser, we can see our new application with that same exact panel. So ultimately, our goal with a banner like this is to welcome new visitors to our site. Say somebody's visiting my site for the first time, I want to make sure they know I have a newsletter and that they can sign up. But if somebody keeps coming back over and over, I don't want them to have to see this before they jump into the content. So instead, I want them to be able to click this hide button and hide it so that anytime they come back, at least before during the browser session, they don't have to see this banner. Now, digging into our code, we're mostly going to work out of this next.js file, which is our home page, where if you open this up, we can see that nothing really special is going on. The only thing that we're doing is importing some posts that I preloaded into this project so that we had some content to work with. What we can see at the top here, we have that sign up banner where it's just going to list out some HTML. It has some styles to make it look halfway decent, and we're going to see how we can programmatically hide this using this button that says hide. Now, starting off with exactly that, we want to be able to use state to store a value dynamically as to whether or not we should be showing the banner. Now, to do this, we're going to use React's use state. So at the top of the page, I'm going to import use state, the structure from React. Now, if this is your first time using React state and you seem like you're having trouble following along, it might make sense to pause for a moment and go learn a little bit more about state before continuing. But now that we have use state in order, we're going to use it to set up a new instance of state. So I'm going to create a new constant that will structure the values from the use state of it, as you'll see in a second here. But I'm going to create a new state variable called show banner. I'm going to add a function that's going to be used to set that value called set show banner. And I'm going to destructure that from use state. Now these brackets here aren't magic. What it's doing is it's using array destructuring to take what's returned from the state, meaning our state variable and the actual function used to update that state variable so that we can have those values to work with inside of our app. We can also set a default value and load up a default without anything else considered. We want to make sure that our banner is showing. So inside of use state, I'm going to set that default value of true. Yes, true, I do want to show the banner. So now that I have my show banner state value, I'm going to use it to conditionally render my banner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this code with a conditional that checks to see if that value is true first. So I'm going to say inside of code brackets, if show banner is true, double inside, I'm going to return some code. That code is going to be my banner. So I'm going to cut it out. I'm going to paste it right inside of that block. So we can see here, it's saying if show banner is true, it's going to return this value. And as we might expect, when we refresh the page, we can see that we still see that banner because we haven't actually added anything dynamic, but we set that default value to true. So now to make this banner hidden, we can run this set show banner function, passing in a value of false, meaning this if conditional will be false and it won't render this block, so that we can easily hide our banner. So to do this, I'm going to take that set show banner function and I'm going to go to my hide button and I'm going to say right in that button on click, I want to run a function. I'm going to say inside of that function, I want to set show banner. I'm going to set the value false. And now back inside of my app, if I click hide, you can see that it's completely hidden. But as I mentioned earlier, by default, the app doesn't store that value. So if I refresh the page, you can see that that banner is now back in the page. So this is where local storage comes back in, where we can say that every time that state updates, we're going to update our local storage state by setting that item. But then anytime we load the page, we're going to load that state item and refresh it into our app. So when working in React, we want to avoid adding client-side code like that inside of the actual render block. Instead, we want to break out of that. Particularly, we're going to use the use effect hook, which allows us to run the code after the block has been rendered. So I'm going to import my use effect hook from React, and I'm going to set up a new instance of use effect. For inside, what we're going to do is we're going to run a function, and we're going to set up this dependency array so that anytime the component renders, it's going to fire this function. But we want to make sure that this fires anytime the state updates. So we can take show banner, we can set it as a dependency inside of this effect, meaning it will run as soon as the component renders, but it'll also run anytime show banner changes. And we can test this out by adding a console log statement right inside of that effect. And then we can see when we load this page by default, it still sets true. But if we click hide, see that that show banner was blocked again, showing its current state of false. And again, if we refresh the page, we're going to see that it's shown as true because we're not storing that again in storage. So now, anytime that changes, we want to run local storage set item. So instead of my use effect, I'm going to particularly reference it from the window. I'm going to say window.local storage. I'm going to add set item, and then I will use the particular to set that with. And this is something that we should probably use for the particular application, such as appliances. How about I use my welcome banner app? And while that's probably too long, it doesn't need something that long like that. It should be something that's locally unique to your particular application, especially if you're developing multiple applications locally. That way you don't run into conflicts using local storage for different applications. But in addition to setting my key, I want to also set the value. And this is going to be where show banner comes in. And because I want to make sure that this is always represented as a string, which is how local storage gets stored, I want to wrap this with JSON.stringify. And in this particular instance, we might not necessarily, because we're only storing a value, which will get turned into a string. It becomes trickier when you have one state. I want to reload the page. You can head over to the application tab where you can find the local storage section, select your site, you'll be able to completely see the value there for that value that we just set. Now, when we store this value, we wrap this JSON stringify so that it was turned into a string. As I said, we get a true or false value with the automatic into a string. But when we're working with objects, that's not the effect that we're going to get. For instance, if I'm pasting that same set item statement and I change my test, and if I change instead of JSON stringify, I just have to pass in a raw object. Let's just say test true. If I had enter here, we can see that it's stored by test, but it was stored as this object string. And this isn't something that's going to be useful for me for future reference. This is just a string that describes what it is that I stored. Now, if I run that command again, but this time I wrap it with my keys. Simplify, try and that for in. You can see that it gets updated, and I can see that object value. You can even see that I can read that data. And this means that when I try to hydrate it, grab that data, I can then parse it, turn it back into a regular object. But for now, we're just dealing with our simple values. That's how this works. But now that we have the stored value, let's grab that value so we can update the state of our application when that changes. So we have our first use effect in the sense where here we're setting the value that is. But now let's use the 11 use effect to actually grab the value of each of those loads. I'm going to add flex side. I'm going to this time set x, right? Because we only want this to happen the first time the page loads. But this time, now we can grab the value that was stored. And I'm going to first set it in a constant. So I'm saying constant data is equal to window dot local storage. This time I'm going to get item. And I'm going to say that I want to grab it. Yes. Now let's quickly console log that out. I'm going to add my console log and data. And if we reload the page for the first time, we can see that data is shown as true for the value that we're getting. But now if I click hide, see that this local storage value was changed to false. And if I click refresh, you can see that that first data value that's on the above now is false. Now we can see that my welcome banner was converted to true because I didn't actually grab that value to hydrate my React state before it load. But now we can take that same value and we can do just that. Now ultimately we can take set show banner and we set it as that data value. But first of all, remember, we want to make sure that as we certify it, that we also use JSON.parse to grab that value so that if we are using something more complex than a true or false, or even if we're using that, we can actually get the value as it's meant to be stored. But also, if we're not able to actually find that state value, such as if somebody visits for the first time or somebody clears the browsing session, we want to make sure that we don't pass in invalid data because that value will simply default to null. So we want to make sure that we say if data does not equal null, then we'll run that set show banner. Now when we reload the page, we can see that by default, again, we have our welcome banner true. But if I click hide, we can see that it was automatically updated to that false value. But now if I try to refresh the page, you can see that as soon as it loads, I no longer get that banner and it's still persisted as that false value. Now, if you're quick to see it, you might recognize that if you're at the very, very top, you might get a little bit of a flash from that value, but ultimately we want to make sure that we are able to persist the actual experience. And typically when we're working with something like a cart, usually that value that is updated quick enough that somebody can still see data as they're working through their application. As developers, we need to make sure that as we're building app experiences, that we're able to do things that help make it easier for our visitors to actually use our application. That might be saving a persistent state as they use that application. That makes taking advantage of using local storage a great way to be able to persist that state right inside of React. What's your favorite use case of local storage, or has it been helpful for you in the past? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about using native APIs inside of React, you can check out my video triggering a function when stolen to an element in React with the intersection observer to see how we can change content or update content whenever somebody scrolls to an element. Or if you want to learn how to use browser event listeners to do things like allow somebody to use keyboards to navigate search autocomplete results, check out my video, Browser Event Listeners in React and search autocomplete. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.
Sekian dari saya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.